Good evening, everyone. Avid Learning in association with Penguin India presents Calcutta, 2 Years in the City. Avid is a story of the passionate who believe continuous learning energizes us throughout life. Avid Learning is an SR initiative that fosters creative learning across the fields of literature, culture and heritage, art, visual applied and performing through various platforms that include workshops, lectures and panel discussions. Last year we reached over 10,000 interested learners with over 110 unique workshops, events and programs. This year began with a curtain raiser to the DSE Jaipur Literature Festival with sister cities, Mumbai, Karachi and New York, an interesting discussion between H.M. Naqvi and Naresh Fernandes. We had a full-day workshop on decoding art deco, architecture, furniture, jewelry design and its importance on Mumbai. At the Jaipur Literature Festival, Avid presented a panel, The Artist's Eye, with leading cultural theorist Homi Bhabha discussing modern art with Glenn Lowry, the director of MoMA, Mark Quinn and William Kentridge. Avid presented the Speakers Forum at the India Art Fair in Delhi, followed by a successful approaches to arts management workshop with Australian faculty Dr. Joe Cost. Last week we presented Gothic Bombay with conservation architect Abha Narayan Lamba and Siddharth Bhatia. This was a lecture on the development of Mumbai's Gothic buildings, a discussion on the city's ongoing conservation plan for specific precincts, and the relaunch of Christopher London's iconic book, Bombay Gothic. As a knowledge partner to the Focus Festival Mumbai, Avid has created 2 photography workshops. On Friday, March 15th, Avid will be presenting a conversation with Suni Taraporwala and Meera Nair in celebration of Suni's show Parsis at the Kemall Prescott Road. March will include a partnership with Art Dubai, followed by a food writing and food photography workshop in April. More information is available at our registration desk and on our website. We would like to thank our venue partner, Jamini and Maithili Aluwalia, and the entire Bungalow 8 team, Time Out India, our media partner, and Himali, Soni and Amrita for Penguin for their support. This evening, we celebrate the launch of Amit Chaudhuri's book, Calcutta, 2 Years in the City, with a discussion between Amit Chaudhuri and Naresh Fernandes on how Calcutta has balanced its history with 21st century issues, drawing out the interesting similarities and differences between Calcutta and Bombay. And now to introduce Amit Chaudhuri. He is the author of 5 novels, the latest of which is The Immortals. Among the many prizes he has won for his fiction are the Commonwealth Literature Prize, the Betty Task Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the Sahitya Academy Award. He is also a highly respected critic, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and the professor of contemporary literature at the University of East Anglia. He lives in Kolkata and Norwich and is also an acclaimed musician. Naresh Fernandes is a journalist living in Mumbai. He is the founder-editor of Time Out India and the author of Taj Mahal Foxtrot, the story of Bombay's jazz age. He is also Avid's literary advisor. Now I'll hand it over to Naresh Fernandes to take us through a journey called Calcutta. Thank you.
Good evening and thanks for being here. It's wonderful to be here in discussion with Amit Chaudhuri about his new book about Calcutta. When my book about Bombay jazz history was released last year, it had a reaction I hadn't quite foreseen. Every few weeks since then, I've been getting email or a phone call from a jazz fan in Calcutta who proceeds to tell me, sometimes politely and often rather more forcefully, that I've gone and demonstrated to the world that I really don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Yes, my correspondent will say, Bombay may have had a few jazz bands and I may have reproduced a few photographs of them, but as anybody with any sense knows, it was really Calcutta that was India's jazz capital. This dismissal of my work is usually followed by a nostalgic description of long evenings spent listening to Pam Crane at Trinca's or Louis Banks at the Hindustan International Hotel or Bras Gonsalves at the Blue Fox. These conversations always remind me of a passage from Amitav Ghosh's essay, The Imam and the Indian. When, as a PhD student, Amitav arrived in a little village in the middle of Egypt to do his fieldwork, he was taken to meet the cleric at the local mosque. But soon the encounter turned quite heated. The Imam commented that Indians were barbaric because we burn our dead. And Amitav countered that cremation was actually a practice that was quite common even in the West. He's lying, the Imam told the crowd that had gathered. They don't burn their dead in the West. They're not ignorant people. They're advanced. They're educated. They have science. They have guns and tanks and bombs. We have them too, Amitav shouted back. We have guns and tanks and bombs. And they're better than anything you could have. We're way ahead of you. The Imam, Amitav says, could no longer disguise his anger. Our guns and tanks and bombs are better than theirs, he told the people around him. Ours are second only to the West's. Replied Amitav, it's you who are lying. Why, in my country, we've even had a nuclear explosion. You won't be able to match that in 100 years. Amitav concludes this description by noting, so there we were, the Imam and I, delegates from two superseded civilizations, vying with each other to claim the virtues of the West. And that is a sentiment, I think, that is increasingly marks conversations about Bombay and Calcutta. In our hearts, even those of us who love these places know that they're actually superseded cities, that these great metropolises that were once the cradle of India's future have now lost their cutting edge, that the place we've derided for very long as crass and uncultured, it's actually overtaken us, that the Indian dream of the 21st century will actually be born perhaps in Delhi. Amit, your last novel, The Immortals, uses music as a metaphor to map the transitions in Bombay as you moved from South Bombay to, coincidentally, the street on which I live, St. Cyril Road in Bandra. What are your thoughts when you come back to Bombay now as an occasional visitor?
Well, yeah, I grew up here. When I was growing up here, I didn't actually like the city very much. Now I don't like Calcutta. Maybe it's a condition of living in a city that you don't like it. But I also think that Bombay hadn't quite come into its own. That's kind of arguable maybe. And you say it's already in decline. But when I was living here, my visits to Calcutta would be for me as a child electrifying, because I didn't feel that I had encountered anything of the sort that I did when I was in Calcutta. I hadn't encountered anything like that in Bombay. And we can come back to what I mean by that anything. But certainly, I mean, until the late 60s, Calcutta was probably the urban center in India. Now, when I began to visit, when my parents moved to Calcutta finally in 1989, I encouraged them to do so. I never thought I would miss Bombay. Later on, when I would visit it, I would realize how attached I was to these spaces, which were probably now a kind of hinterland in Bombay, where I had grown up and gone to school. I mean, spaces not far from here, because I went to cathedral school. So I remember that journey full of dread as the car approached Flora Fountain, and I knew school was coming closer and closer. That fearful journey now, the kind of dread of that has gone, and I realized that these are the spaces in which I grew up, and I understand how much I am of this city. So you asked me what I feel about it now. So one of the places that I sometimes stay in when I visit this city where I don't have a property to live in anymore. The last property that my family owned, my father owned, was on St. Cyril Road. And you know, he had no idea at that time just how much, my father, how much India would change, how much Bombay would change, and how much we would change in our relationship with Bombay, and that we would ever want to have a property over here. So now I don't have anywhere to live in except, you know, the clubs, one or two clubs that have residential facilities that I'm a member of, or in hotels. So one of these clubs is now called the Malabar Hill Club, which is quite an interesting place. And when I was growing up, it was almost a kind of mysterious non-place, facing a house called Il Palazzo, which is where I grew up. So in extreme privilege and luxury, I confess. And people who lived in Il Palazzo were made automatically life members of this non-club or non-place, which was then called WIAA Club. So nowadays, sometimes I spend my visits in Malabar Hill Club because it has residential facilities, and from there I look out onto the building I grew up in. So I have this, I have to say, I have this kind of experience in various places, that I keep visiting places which are a part of, an integral part of my life, but in relation to which I have no ownership. No ownership at all. Most, in relation to most of the important places of my life, I can say. Even my uncle's house, which I described in A Strange and Sublime Address in Calcutta, has been torn down, and there's another house in its place. Now, the other thing that I feel about Bombay, what I felt about Bombay, was, of course, it was alchemized by economic deregulation. Calcutta lost out for reasons of its own. It didn't open itself up to investment, to the changes that were happening, until it was forced to. Of course, even India deregulated when it was forced to, but once it did, the city of Bombay responded to it, let's say in a slightly different way from Delhi, which elected itself the main city because it was the capital, the center of power, and poured money into itself. But with Bombay, it wasn't just a case of the center pouring money into Bombay. It was genuinely, I think, transformed by deregulation. But then there were changes from the city that I had grown up in, obviously. One was the kind of extension of the city into various places that I had never visited when I was growing up. Because property prices being what they are in this part of the city kept on extending, flyovers kept being built, and you had new access and new vantage points on areas which you had never seen before when you were growing up. Also new restaurants. Like, actually, when I was growing up here, I had never heard of Mahesh Lunch Home. So this is a post-globalization discovery for me. And then I think what I'm not so sure about, and I don't know if this kind of ties in with your decline or whether your decline is about economic decline, but what I'm not so sure about is how to define the culture of the city today. So there's been this unprecedented rise of Bollywood, of course, as the main cultural face of Bombay, in a way that in the 70s one could never have foreseen, the 60s and 70s, that Bollywood would become so central to Bombay's identity. Then there has been the intellectual downgrading of various things, including the main paper here, the Times of India, which pioneered that as a kind of mode of newspaper kind of reporting or whatever. I mean, I'm no insult meant to it, any Times of India reporter over here, but knowing the kind of discussion we are having, there probably are none. So
identify yourselves if you are there.
So they pioneered a form of journalism, which then other newspapers have imitated in India. It's a very peculiarly Indian form, like the book launch. You know, it is a peculiarly Indian form of journalism. There's no, the page 3 means something completely different outside of India.
Something also funnier.
Also funnier, but also very specifically tabloid.
Exactly.
And then the expulsion maybe of the university to the outskirts of the city. I think those have been, as far as I'm concerned, those have had an effect on the life of the city. I don't know, maybe that has had no effect in terms of its decline or its rise or its further rise.
No, I think there's definitely a sense, as you point out, that in the institution, especially in public discourse, that it's all now moved to Delhi. That between JNU and DU,
the academic and the intelligentsia,
and also putting these ideas from New India, media for what it is, and the TV industry, the dominant discourse of the day is now created in Delhi.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And that's something that you remark upon in your book when you met all of these people from St. Stephen's tramping through Oxford.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I first began to become aware what an important city Delhi was becoming and how it had elected that it become this important city. I mean, promoted itself, as it were, it was not difficult for it to do it because it had been the center of power. Suddenly, all these bureaucrats began to have children who suddenly decided that now we are the ruling class. So it was the first proper post-independence establishment, proper post-independence, those who had no roots in colonial India coming into being, as it were. And I first encountered them in Oxford. In the late 1987, I discovered that most of the Indians who had come to Oxford on scholarships were from Delhi. And out of the ones who had come from Delhi, most of them were from St. Stephen's College. And St. Stephen's, you know, that too is an excellent college, but certainly was not the premier college at that time. I mean, there was Presidency, there was St. Xavier's, there was Elphinstone, which went completely downhill around that time. So one witnessed what continues to be a fascinating thing under liberalization, this continual remaking of establishments. Who are the powerful people? You know, every few months, the constellation changes slightly, and then you have to deal with somebody else. You know, there's somebody else on some level to deal with. Like, for instance, Suhail Seth is an interesting example of somebody you now have to deal with. You know, he's there, you can't escape him. He wasn't there earlier. So with the Delhi people, again, I mean, you have to deal with these people. They were then at university, but they were already kind of quite certain that they wanted to go back to India and become part of what they themselves called the ruling class. And they also spoke in terms of the Indian administrative service, of bureaucracy, with a kind of regard and respect, and also following in their father's footsteps, and also finishing PhDs and going on to postdoctoral fellowships with a kind of ambition and seriousness that, growing up in Bombay and having had a lot to do with Calcutta, one had always thought, rather stupidly, that all the interesting and intelligent people were those who didn't finish their PhDs, you know, who were out of work and who were sort of kind of not doing anything serious in life. And these were some of the most intelligent people you met and who ended up doing interesting things. Never had I seen a class that was so intent on filling in their father's shoes until the late 80s. I met the Delhi set.
It's interesting that you bring up Suhail Seth because he's a Calcutta boy who chose to move to Delhi. Among other things, I mean, when you talk about changes in Calcutta, the physical descriptions, especially the changes in architectural styles, are something that you touch upon quite strongly. I think there's one feature of Bombay architecture that's under siege. It's the great Bombay balcony, that in-between space of sociability that allows sort of residents to engage with the city on its own terms. But you you've thought a lot about the Calcutta French window. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, the Calcutta French window, I mean, and probably later on I'll read a section about these windows. Nobody ever notices these French windows. They have been quite ubiquitous. They are French windows of a certain kind, in that they are not extremely tall or vertical. They are kind of long, window-like, slatted wooden windows. You see them in and part of all kinds of buildings, including colonial buildings, including the houses in the south of Calcutta, in Bhawanipur and North Calcutta, ordinary houses where people, middle-class people too, have lived. Each house having sort of family resemblances with other houses in the area, but not identical, like, let's say, the English houses, the semi-detached houses are, which are parodied in Asterix, when Asterix goes to Britain. All these same sort of looking houses. Now, here, these houses are mutations of each other, but they have family resemblances. Red, stone floors, balcony, terrace. Terrace is, the rooftop is a kind of integral part of these houses. So when you go to the rooftop of one of the houses, you'll always see a sea of rooftops around you. And then the French windows, the slatted windows. No one thinks of them as French windows at all. And it's just part of my kind of inquiry into the curious nature of the city and how difficult it is to completely decide what its provenance is and what it made of its provenance. Because ordinarily we think of its provenance being British colonial. So the moment people talk about architecture in Calcutta, they talk about colonial architecture. And actually we don't have that much of a predominance of the new Gothic architecture which you have in Bombay. But then you go to England, you go to London, you don't see anything like what you see in Calcutta. There seems to be no connection between the cities. However, you go to Brussels, or you go to even Geneva, and you go to France, you go to Europe and you find yourself confronted with ways of life which have something in common with Calcutta. And those ways of life have been captured by the respective artists of these cultures in let's say, on film, in ways that are very different from, let's say, stock realism. So the poets of cinema, like Renoir and his disciple Ray, always capture what is ramifying outside in the neighborhood. And when you go to France or when you go to Bhawanipur in Calcutta, you can make sense of this, because windows open onto balconies, and then rooftop looks out on rooftop, and there's always a sense of something happening elsewhere. You can also hear what's happening elsewhere, even while you're located in a particular place. So the stock in trade of realism about story, character, etc. won't do, because you're located somewhere where you're also always aware of something else, somewhere else. And that joins cities like Calcutta to European cities, but maybe also to, I don't know, Buenos Aires, Tehran, I have no idea. From Tehran I mentioned because of what I've seen of Kiarostami's cinema. And again, you look at Kiarostami films and you look at Tehran and you think, where did these buildings come from? They don't look very Islamic to me. What is Islamic? So there are those kind of pictures in the background, actually. I mean, there are those windows. Now, it's difficult just by glancing at that to know where you are, except after you glance at that. But those windows are there above that, above those posters too. So, I mean, just to refer back to something that Gayatri Spivak, with whom I was on a panel, this cultural theorist called Gayatri Spivak. I was on a panel with her in Jaipur. So she was relating an anecdote about her mother. Apparently her mother said to her when she heard that Gayatri Di was going to London, oh, London, isn't it a lot like Calcutta? And then Gayatri Di turned to her and said, no, actually, Calcutta is a lot like London. to kind of debunk the kind, the assumptions, the presumptions we make that where we are is the definition of everything else. However, actually, Calcutta is not a lot like London.
Well, as you point out, Calcutta is not even like Calcutta anymore. The circumstances of the renaming of Calcutta weren't quite as contentious as the renaming of Bombay. And yet, just like Bombay, you say that this new city with a new name is a completely new place. What marks out this Kolkata?
Kolkata. I'll come to Kolkata in a second. Something just occurred to me about Bombay and Calcutta in relation to what I was saying to do with the French windows and the sense of foreignness. You said Calcutta isn't Calcutta anymore. That's what made me think about it. Yes, on many levels, Calcutta isn't Calcutta anymore. But Calcutta never was Calcutta. I say this because, so I wrote my first book, A Strange and Sublime Address. It was set in Bhawanipur, although I never mentioned the actual name of the locality I was describing. A lot of people came to me and said, a lot of people from Calcutta said, this is wonderful descriptions of North Calcutta in the book. So I said, actually, it isn't North Calcutta, it's South Calcutta, it's Bhawanipur. So, oh, of course, Bhawanipur is the North Calcutta of the South. I remember thinking about Calcutta, thinking about writing the book after my parents had moved to St. Cyril Road, and I was coming back, I came back from England between University College London and going to Oxford, took a year off and spent it in St. Cyril Road and began to write the novel. I went and bought an accounts register and began to write the novel in it. And one of the reasons is, I think, something about being in St. Cyril Road, firstly being on a second-story apartment rather than 25th or 12th story, but also, is this Bombay? I had, of course, visited Bandra before, and to visit Bandra always felt, at that time, in the 60s and 70s, as if you had gone much further afield than you really had. You'd gone to a different place, a different world. And now to live in that world, which is already ebbing and disappearing and changing, to come and visit it during the holidays was also to become aware of foreign places within cities. And Bhawanipur was also such a foreign place, and Calcutta is, I think many modern cities are full of such foreign places, and I think that's what I have always responded to, not to the idea of home or place itself, but to the idea of a foreign place within a city. Now the other question, which you asked me, what was the question?
What is the difference between, how has Calcutta changed after the name change?
After the name change. So, Kolkata, you were asking about Kolkata. Well, I mean, as I say, Kolkata is a provincial metropolis. I mean, I've tried not to describe the mindset of Calcutta very much, but one could, Firstly, and in connection with this, a lot of people also ask me why I named the book Calcutta rather than Kolkata. And the answer to that is that I always use the word Kolkata when I'm speaking in Bangla. And when I'm speaking in English, I've always used the word Calcutta. And, a governmental sort of edict is not going to suddenly allow me to change my habit overnight. Secondly, I think Calcutta has a sort of colloquial life, that it is part of a spoken idiom, spoken language in English. Kolkata, similarly, is part of a colloquial life in Bangla. The chaste word for Kolkata in Bengali is Kolikata. But no one says Kolikata anymore unless in jest. So Kolkata in English for me is a dead word. It's like Xanadu. It's a non-existent place. It's like a poetic word, a utopian word. So now this brings us to what Kolkata, the mindset of Kolkata today, is I think partly when it relates to its own history and its past, it is a sort of utopian past. Firstly, it doesn't think very much about its past and its public spaces and the past embodied in the public spaces. And when you think about the past, a curious kind of nostalgia takes over. But there's a kind of utopianism going on, and I'll give you a couple of examples of it. Let's say to do with Tagore. So in the last 10 years, you've suddenly seen the rise of the already risen within Bengal Tagore, to the extent that, of course, I mean, the songs are now played at traffic junctions because that is an edict of Mamata Banerjee's. But besides that, all of Tagore's contemporaries are now much less in people's minds. I'm now only talking about the singer-songwriters who are contemporaries of Tagore. There were people like Rajanikanto Sen, D.L. Rai, Atul Prasad, and the great Nojrul, who was very popular. Suddenly in the last 10 years, all these people who then give a picture, if taken together, of a culture that is extremely varied, they suddenly have gone into the background, and you just have the Tagore song. Then the Tagore song in restaurants like O Calcutta, where my book was launched in Delhi, is presented as background music in a digital version. That is, a machine has been sequenced to play the songs. So there's no one actually playing anything, but you have all these Tagore songs. So basically what you have are dead versions of Tagore songs, dead and perfect versions of Tagore songs. That's one example of the utopianism. The other one is something I've written about none of these in the book, but these are all part and parcel of Kolkata, the cultural life. And the other one is actually not located in Kolkata, but made up of people from Kolkata. And this is something called the Bongo Shommelon, the Bengali conference, which is held in North America once a year. And what happens then is that Bengalis from all over America, not all Bengalis obviously, but a sizable minority of the Bengalis, will travel to a particular American city. It might be Atlanta, it might be Toronto, because it's North America, wherever. And then they will occupy for 3 days a kind of town hall, and they'll shut out the fact that they are in Toronto or Atlanta. And they will convert that town hall into Dhakuria or Golf Green, which are areas in Calcutta. In Dhakuria and Golf Green, a particular utopian rehearsal of Bengali culture, comprising a motley bunch: Tagore, Sushmita Sen, Saurabh Ganguly. A motley sort of bunch will provide the coordinates of what Bengali culture is. What is most interesting to me is that it has no truck with America as it's happening outside. And this is quite different from the openness that defined Calcutta. And also the very creative take on the past that people like Tagore had. You know, Tagore songs are like a collage. Tagore is a bricoleur. I mean, he works with what he has. He's not originating it all from the genius inside his head. He is actually, if you look at books written by people who, of that time, people of his family, they talk about how members of the family were listening to itinerants and various kinds of people. Maybe many of them, like your people you talk about in your jazz milieu in Bombay, maybe like the Hindi film music directors, they're really collecting tunes from all kinds of sources. The Hindustani classical, folk from all kinds, Western, Scottish, Irish, Indian, Baul, they are collectors. And then they're making huge departures as they turn songs into other kinds of songs. Like Ekla Cholore, Jodi Tor Dak Shune Keu Na Ashe Tobe Ekla Cholore is a very famous song. The tune is a complete Baul devotional song which is turned into a sort of a song about aloneness and nationalism. So these were people who had no respect for the static quality of the past. The past was there to be made use of.
So how come this stuff isn't in your book? Music is a theme in so much of what else you've written, and you're a performer yourself. Calcutta, for instance, has the only, I think, homegrown rock and roll rock scene in the country. How did you resist the temptation to keep music largely out of this book?
It was a lapse of, it was just something that slipped my mind. I was writing, as I said, in real time. I began to write the book finally in 2009, having resisted writing the book. And then I was describing the people who live in the city, including myself. Why on earth are we there? Why are we here? And there was a moment at which I began to believe that there were people here, and they, including myself, and there were stories to do with these people. And so I began to write about these people. Musicians would have come into it in as much as they might have become a story of this resistance I had to seeing or engaging with the people who lived in post-Bhadralok Calcutta, and then got around to actually writing about them, including myself. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. At one point, I thought it would be nice to write about a young rock band, because they are part of this new Calcutta too. But, you can't write about all the interesting ideas or events that you want very much to write about. There were other things that I wanted to
So instead of music, it's food that becomes among the vehicles through which you explore what the effects globalization has had in Calcutta. Tell us about your adventures with pasta.
Well, that comes towards the latter half, towards the end of the book, when I suddenly thought, because I'd been interacting with all kinds of people, including, people on Park Street, beggars on Park Street, and the people who run, within quotes, hotels, which means pavement sort of eating places on Park Street, sometimes close to maybe a restaurant I've often been to, and then come out, not Park Street here, but the one which is adjacent to Park Street, Free School Street, come out of Mocambo. Have you ever been there?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting place. It's one of those retro places which doesn't know it's retro, but somehow it's thriving, So come out of there, and then you turn left, and then there is a place called the Chandan Hotel, which caters to kind of itinerants, homeless people, etc. So I had shut out those people because, Free School Street used to have a great bohemian life in the 60s and 70s. I have bought fantastic vinyl records and sold them there as well. And some of my friends have sold my records too. So you would keep shutting out those people. Thinking, who are these people? They are not Calcutta. And then one fine day as I began writing the book, thought, let me speak to these people, very aware at the same time of the ridiculousness of what I was doing. But I'm glad I did it, because inadvertently, I understood that these people live in the same Calcutta I do. Most of them are from Bihar. And having done that, from an echo, in a kind of echo in my brain from somewhere, I began to think, also, when I go to the 5-star hotels, who are these Italian guys who come and make up the menus and then disappear? They hang around for 2 or 3 years. Who are these people? And then Sean Kenworthy, the chef, the English chef at the park. Firstly, an English chef, isn't that a contradiction in terms? Secondly, what is he doing in this city? Why is Sean Kenworthy here? Then I thought that these are the kind of descendants of the white Mughals that William Dalrymple wrote about. This is the closest we'll get to white Mughals.
They wear robes?
I don't know what they do at home, but they wear the chef's uniform, which is also quite regal. And so I began to see them in this kind of, because some of them married and stayed on, and they were many of them had this mission that I will bring true Italian food to Calcutta, which, the Orientalists, William Jones, all these people who came to Calcutta when it first began to become this cultural crucible, and then created this whole, through their researches, the idea of the Indo-European languages happened in the Asiatic Society in Calcutta. They too had a mission. Now here were these people with their own mission to bring in basil, etc., the right ingredients, not to compromise. Yeah. So, I kind of thought, I want to write about them, and I thought people are going to attack me for writing about this. Well, I haven't been attacked yet, but I'm waiting for the kind of...
Among the things you bemoan is your inability to find authentic cheesecake. Have you been able to find it yet? And why weren't you able to find it in the first place?
See, authentic cheesecake is, again, I mean, this is me towards the latter half of the book in the section to do with the Italian chefs called Italians Abroad, where I'm talking about my bafflement about the new India. You know, it's not just Calcutta, the bafflement about new India. And I speak about it through food, because, you know, you have pizzas, then you have cheesecake, which doesn't taste like cheesecake at all. Until you go to some plush place in Delhi where they have painfully recreated this lovely but plebeian cake, really. The cheesecake. I mean, so much is being done that is more complicated. As you said, nuclear bombs were exploded a long time ago, but in the new India, they're unable to produce cheesecake, but they're being eaten anyway. So then, connected to this were my other experience, like in the Taj over here. I've recounted that. I love ginger pudding. You know, this is kind of colonial stodge that I've grown up with. So I go to the Taj, my wife and I, on a visit, and I see on the menu of, what is their coffee shop called? I can't remember now. One, Shamiana. So I see ginger pudding. I said, fantastic. You know, I'm going to have ginger pudding. I'm not feeling hungry, but I'm going to have. So I said, can I have the ginger pudding? He brings me, this is January, he brings me a plate with Christmas pudding on it. So I thought, this ginger pudding looks remarkably like Christmas pudding. So I eat it, it is Christmas pudding. So I said, excuse me, can you give me ginger pudding, please? This is, I think this is Christmas pudding. So he goes off. He comes back, plate, it has got Christmas pudding on it. He says, this is ginger pudding. So I eat it again, I said. Now, what does this say about the new India and what they think about the kind of people who have the money to eat ginger pudding, which is, again, a plebeian food, you know? And the fact that they bring you, then the chef or the manager came to me and said, sorry, sir, came later on. Because the guy who was serving me, I felt very bad, and he thought I was a kind of dangerous person. And he finally brought the manager, and he said, sorry, we've run out of ginger pudding. I mean, you could have said that, you know. So now this sounds terrible. It is terrible. I'm expecting a lot of criticism to come in for writing that chapter. But I wanted to put on record what it means to be in this new India. You know, it's very confusing.
Along with the change in Calcutta, you also talk about the Poribortan. And you seem to have been skeptical of Mamta even in the build-up. Why is that? What were the signs you saw that made you so suspicious of her?
Well, I mean, it's not very difficult unless you are, you know, deluded in a sort of pathological way, to notice that, you know, that she must have a completely different personality and a different side to her to make this work, to be a person who actually can get something done. There's a side she's keeping hidden from the public. And the side that we saw, that I saw, whatever. By the way, I'm told that my mother tells me, who cannot stand her, went to receive an award from her on my behalf. This is the Bengali government's highest literary honor called the Robindra Puruskar. And so I was given it for whatever reason, and I wasn't around. So she went and received it, and I hope no one reports it, but she was extremely charming, and somebody told me she has bipolar disorder. So that she can be extremely charming. Anyway, this is between us. It's not to go outside, please. You know, but she never showed any signs of having policies, and she's unable to articulate her ideas and herself. And I've also seen her, before she came to power, resorting to emotional blackmail again and again as a means of persuasion. So instead of actually coming up with argument, it was emotional blackmail. So I thought, what? I mean, this is obviously a terrible idea, but at the same time, you know, that it was impossible to keep the left front government in power anymore. Although, you know, that day when I went to vote, which I've discussed, written about in the book, I did, although I haven't said it. I know you guys can keep a secret. I did vote for CPIM. But that was not because of the party, but because the candidate. opposing him was a total crook from the Trinamool Congress. So, CPM was being represented by a selfless doctor, a guy I know is actually a selfless doctor. So, I didn't want the CPM to come in. I didn't want this crook to be my sort of MP. And the other option was not to vote, which I didn't want to do at that time. So you can tell from my dilemma what a hard, difficult situation people are in Calcutta. Before we become too complacent here in Bombay, we should realize that actually government in India, both on the national and state levels, are full of horrendous people. Mamata Banerjee is by no means the worst of them at all. Yeah, I mean, if you look at politics here in Maharashtra in the last 20, 30 years, it's just that deregulation has been accepted here, and that is a wonderful panacea for us, a means of forgetting about the reality of our politicians. But if you actually look at Narendra Modi, if you look at Shiv Sena, Mahanirman Sena, it is very difficult to understand how people can tolerate the political reality of the new India. I think once Calcutta begins to boom, which I thought would inevitably happen given the logic of the free market, but it hasn't happened yet. Once, then, Mamata Banerjee, we will she'll be in the background of our consciousness.
I know there are lots of people here who spend time in Calcutta and want to ask questions, so let's open this up to the audience now.
I always thought that the strange and sublime address was in Shambhajar, so thank you for clearing that up. You made an interesting point about how the cities we live in inform who we are in some ways. We are where we live, especially when we're young. So what happens when you revisit a place that you've grown up in and has formed a little bit of who you are, and that physical space doesn't exist anymore, like your uncle's house in the book? Does that then lead to a gap in yourself? How do you feel about that?
Well, for a number of reasons, Tariq, to do with experiences such as you mentioned, that you visit a place and it no longer is what it used to be, but also other reasons. The people you knew there don't exist anymore, or they've become completely different, or whatever. I mean, when I was, so I'll give you two answers to this. The first is when I was growing up, or until even maybe 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And I think globalization, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the world as it exists now has made me realize this. Because no one, at least I, when I was growing up, never thought that admittedly a contingent arrangement like the bipolar world, that is the Soviets on one side and their satellites, the non-aligneds in the middle, and the Americans on the other, the free world. No one thought that arrangement was ever going to change. I mean, no one would have thought about it. Of course, the communists always wanted, that everybody would one day become communist. That was part of their utopia. But growing up in the middle and traveling or whatever, no one. So what I'm saying is that one was formed first of all by a world which would change completely in a way one hadn't foreseen. And I think this happens frequently, more frequently than we realize. But it maybe happens once or twice in a lifetime. And in my lifetime, the first time it happened was with this. The fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the gradual understanding of its consequences to oneself as an individual, but also as a writer, as a published writer. What the kind of spread of the free market does to the idea of writing, to the idea of culture, none of which one could have foreseen earlier. This is also connected to then what we do in cities, in places we think we know. And so certainly, for a long time I thought the world is a slightly mystifying place, but the more you live in it, like the more you live in a neighborhood, the better you get to know it. And then one day it will become completely familiar and understandable and comprehensible. And I see that it's the opposite. The more you live, the years go past, it less and less comprehensible it becomes. It becomes stranger and stranger, the neighborhood. That is one thing. The other thing is, since you mentioned the building coming down, thankfully the building in that case, my uncle's house, coming down is fresh in my mind, not only because I wrote about it, but because I don't visit the new house which has come up in its place that often. But if I do visit it often, then I will forget gradually the older building. It has happened to me with changes I've seen. Like when I first went to Oxford as a graduate student, opposite one of the cinemas on George Street was a parking lot. The parking lot had apparently come up in the place of something else. A year later, the parking lot was converted into a 4 kind of piazza. Now I can't remember the parking lot. This is for writers to do, to excavate, for critics, for writers to do, excavate memory. Because otherwise memory behaves in a very strange way. And then you become immersed in what there is. Which is why it is also an act of excavation to remember that the way I'm thinking about books now, the way I'm thinking about the world now, I'm thinking about Bombay now, the way I'm thinking about success now, is not actually the way it always was. It wasn't that way in the 60s, it wasn't that way in the 70s. What was it to live under that kind of semi-socialism? How did we think of books? How did we regard writers? Very, very difficult to think now. Now we think that, the more a book sells, the better it is. Now, even if one conscious part of our mind knows that this need not necessarily be the case. Now, there was a time, 30, 40 years ago, when it was held that the more a book sold, the worse it was. We have forgotten what it means now to have had that thought. And it's in that thought that certain books, lots of books that we now regard as great books, The Goodbye to Berlin, Ulysses, Mrs. Dalloway, were all written when that thought was held in the mind. It may have been wrong or right, that thought. So we completely forget, too. So, the kind, so it's difficult, as to how familiar we become with a place, what we think is familiar, and how much we actually remember of that old building, the one you're talking about.
Gyan.
You said a few moments ago in response to Naresh's question that you're not interested in the idea of home that much, but foreignness in the city. And so I had a question around that. So somewhere in the beginning of the book, somewhere around page 450 or something, you say that Calcutta was never home, and you suspect it'll never be your home. And then a little bit later, you go on to say that you had certain divides in your life growing up. There was a Calcutta-Bombay divide, and there was an India-England divide. Yeah. And that every time from Bombay you went to Calcutta, you were delighted to be away from Bombay and in Calcutta. And then when you came back from England to Calcutta, you got out of the plane and you said to yourself, happy to be back. Okay? So there is a...
Thank God I'm back. Yeah, yeah.
Something like...
whatever. I can't remember the exact words. Yeah.
So obviously there is a certain attachment to the city of Calcutta. It's not home. So my question is, the reason why you move away or reject the idea of home, is it because home has a sense of finality or commitment to it, whereas you want to maintain a certain kind of, option or openness? And so if Calcutta is not home in that sense, what kind of attachment is it, and can you name it?
Sure, yeah. Well, firstly, I've had an attachment to Calcutta for a very, very long time. So it occupies a disproportionate amount of my memory. So I would visit Calcutta for 2 months a year, sometimes 2.5 months a year from Bombay. Lots of people elide the fact that my first book is about a person visiting from Bombay, and they think Calcutta is where I grew up. These are my childhood memories, that the Calcutta childhood was my childhood. But actually it wasn't. Bombay was my childhood, and Calcutta was a break. What was I attached to in that city that I discovered through the 60s into the mid-70s? As I've said in the book and as I've said elsewhere, I think Calcutta, and as I said earlier today, Calcutta is where I was schooled in what a modern city is. So I was on holiday, but I was being educated. But educated in a way that was very close to what gave me most pleasure or excitement, that is the city. And it also schooled me in what actually a city is. So what is a city? I suppose a city is, in the way I understand it, the cities that arose in the 19th century, the great cities were transformed and created by 19th century industrialization. The cities, therefore, often were places of alienation, decay, but at the same time of excitement, of cultural vibrancy. And the cities were made up of different homes and places within the city, which made it seem like, or different personalities within the city, which made it feel like going from one neighborhood to another, one part of the city, one part of Calcutta to another part of Calcutta, one part of Berlin to another part of Berlin, is like a journey to a different world within the city. It was like traveling a kind of world. I say this in contrast to, let's say, a kind of what I think of as the growth of a certain kind of postmodern city. There are many kinds, but a certain kind, let's say, where the airport is the city, like Singapore or Dubai. On some levels, you think, I've been to the airport, I've been, where it is, I don't need to go out there anymore. Or where a mall is the city, like Kuala Lumpur. I went to Kuala Lumpur, there's actually nobody on the streets. And there are places where people live. But everybody actually, when they want to go somewhere, they go to those twin towers where the mall is, which is a kind of city. But one can't say the same about Calcutta or Berlin or New York. Berlin or New York or Calcutta, you make a journey from one part of the city to another, and you've made a long journey. And you're constantly encountering foreignness within a single city. And I think I grew addicted to these paradoxes. The industrialized, the old. When I say old, I mean, Calcutta, after all, is not a very old city. It's about, a little more than 300 years old. And yet it seems to have accumulated history, so that even the old photographs of Calcutta and the old film shots of Calcutta don't make Calcutta seem new. Calcutta doesn't seem like a spanking new city in any of those old photographs or watercolors. It always looks as if it's accumulated history. Unlike, let's say, it's again, a place like Dubai or whatever, which seems spanking new when you go to it. So, it was a kind of addiction that grew in me, that I first, for a particular kind of city, which I first encountered in Calcutta. So when I went to America for the first time, I think it was in 1979, I spent 2 weeks in San Diego with my cousin, and I felt completely suffocated, I remember, by the prettiness, and by what was then my first encounter of the suburban city. That people don't actually walk here, people don't loiter here. You have these houses and you have the cars. And you don't have public transport either. And then you have a lot of orderly prettiness. And in 79, I still didn't know what the suburb was. So my idea of the suburb was Bandra. I'd been told it was the queen of suburbs. But this wasn't like Bandra at all. So then we went to New York, and I remember New York was in economic decline at that time. And certainly far away from becoming the first city of the world in this new unipolar arrangement and cleaned up by Giuliani. But I remember being quickened by it and also sniffing out something in it immediately, that the addict has that alertness. I found it. It's here. And it was that particular stink of a particular kind of city that I found there. Now you ask me, when I go back now, what is the nature of my attachment? Why do I say I'm an outsider? So that city, which quickened me in that way, has changed. Kolkata, from Calcutta, or whatever, however I continue calling it Calcutta, has changed inwardly in many ways. Just as I think New York has in a completely different way, although it's booming, that you don't feel yourself quickened as you did by those spaces in the present day. In New York, I think the boom has made people consume those old spaces, consume ideas of the old New York. In Calcutta, there's a kind of abeyance. When I land in Calcutta, my missing Calcutta, or my missing India, I miss India. I miss almost all of India, except maybe Delhi. But when I long for India, it's on a very irrational physical level. So I long to be back home. I long for the decentered life that I became aware was my own in India, when I began to live in London, closed windows, the weather, silence, none of the things, all the things which I find it difficult to take. Then coming back to St. Cyril Road, open windows, sounds coming in from outside, never being possible to completely concentrate on anything, whether it's yourself or a book or a television program, the continuous distraction of the outside coming in. This is what I feel physically homesick for. That silence, whether it's in the airport or whether it's in a semi-detached house, is something I find it difficult to take. So then I come back to Calcutta. It could be anywhere else, and it could be Bombay as well. But I come back to Calcutta, and the moment I come back, I have this sense of, again, it is irrational, of having been born again. I'm born again. I step out from the plane into the airport and making my way. Then gradually I realize this is, of course, not exactly that city. The reason I think I'm an outsider to Calcutta, especially after having moved there, is seeing what an incestuous bunch the Bengali middle class has become. Maybe they always were. I mean, of course, even the Delhi lot are very, very incestuous. But in Calcutta, unless you grew up with these people, went not only to the same school, but went to the same colleges, and then can refer in anecdotes to the great teachers and professors you had, and also the family connections. For me, family was a seedbed of gigantic idiosyncrasy. Peripheral people who are daydreaming about their greatness, the grandiosity. But these people are actually grand. The people who are now find themselves related to. They are grand. So-and-so was, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's son-in-laws, whatever. So-and-so was Mohalona Bish's, whatever. So it's a network of family connections, and then anecdotes about, in Presidency College, the way so-and-so lectured on Lear. I mean, I've never heard anything as good as that. So unless you can partake of this anecdotal form of dialogue, which is like a code language, unless you can crack that code, you are on the outside. And I found out I am totally on the outside in Calcutta, not having grown up there. Yeah.
We'll take one last question. Hani.
So when our parents were growing up, they always said, see Paris and die. We were growing up, we were told, see Beirut and die. And
See Beirut.
Yeah, see Beirut and die.
Lovely, yeah.
And somehow in India, the glamour of this sort of see the city and die was really occupied by Calcutta and Bombay. What would you say now for this generation? What would they have to see before they die?
Bombay, I think. I mean, it's
still in the world?
In the world?
Yeah. Paris, Beirut, Bombay, Calcutta.
No,
Bombay?
I like the fact that you mentioned Beirut. Whatever I've seen of what it was like in documentaries, again, it's this amazing manifestation that makes you think, the whole business of modernity, which is what I mean not by electric lights, but by this particular excitement, is not a question of import and export, that it was fostered in the West and then it was kind of imported by others or exported to others. And Beirut, I think, was a place, such a place, one of these centers in the world where modernity had mutated it into something. And I mentioned Beirut in the book because I mentioned, when I'm talking about Calcutta, I talk about the fact that somebody, a woman from Beirut, a publisher who then had settled in London, was reading a section from A Strange and Sublime Address, which is about Calcutta, my first novel. And she was laughing and she phoned a friend, a Pakistani friend, and said, "It reminds me of Beirut." Now, what was being described was one of these houses, the uncle going to the balcony with shaving cream, brush, and his razor on a Sunday, watched by his nephews shave. This reminded her of Beirut. And this tells you something about the nature of the quotidian, the commonplace, becoming sort of instances of excitement in these cities, which were changed in the 19th century. Now, what would I say to people now? I think Bombay, despite Naresh saying it's declining, I would say come to Bombay. People come from outside and tell me Calcutta is the most interesting, these are European people or American people, is the most interesting Indian city they've seen. I don't see it anymore. So maybe on some level I have become a Calcutta person, because I really don't see it being interesting anymore, or in the way it was. I do think Bombay is extremely, an extremely interesting city by any standards. More interesting than New York. Berlin, that's the other city I would ask people to go to.
All right, we come to the part of the evening where we indulge in that great Indian homegrown cultural convention, the book release.
Yeah.
But
subverting the usual flow of things, we've done it at the end, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Mrs. Ruya, if you will launch the book, please. Well, thanks, Amit, for taking us on this journey through your city. For the rest of you, if you can't afford to go down to Calcutta tomorrow to be eating pastries at Fleury's, you can do the next best thing. Swarm to the bookshelf, the bookshop there, get a copy of this wonderful book, and Amit will sign it for you. Thanks.